This morning, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation published footage of an Iskander tactical missile strike on Ukrainian Armed Forces targets in the Chernihiv region. The point of impact was recorded in the area of the village of Stakoreshchina. According to objective monitoring data, several heavy-duty vehicles and minibuses carrying weapons were destroyed, and enemy losses amounted to up to 20 military personnel. This was confirmed by telemetry and visual recording. Craters, fires, and secondary explosions were observed at the site. The footage shows the detonation spreading across the vehicle parking area. The strike was delivered from a high angle, shelters were destroyed, the dispersion of damaging factors was minimal, and the target was hit accurately. To understand how this strike became possible, we need to go back a few days, when the intelligence network received the first reports that the enemy had begun to use quiet areas deep in the rear for reloading ammunition and giving personnel a short rest. The reports mentioned a small rural hub where dirt roads converged and country lanes branched off. On the map, this hub looked insignificant, but in war, such points are crucial, as it is easier to hide equipment and personnel there, and it is more convenient to form small columns for advances closer to the line of contact. Simultaneously with the intelligence reports, technical reconnaissance was activated. The first satellite images with characteristic traces on the ground appeared, then data from radio technical posts came in, short radio sessions were noted, which led to the assumption that a scattered group of enemy communications was operating at the site. At night, rare flashes of light and headlight movement were recorded. During the day, the site looked empty, but the images showed squares of trampled ground, which meant that heavy vehicles were leaving for neighboring fields and returning along a different arc. The enemy was trying to break the usual route so as not to leave direct traces. By the evening of the next day, reconnaissance drones took the area under continuous surveillance. The operators worked in short bursts so as not to reveal their presence, and the flight altitude was adjusted to prevent visual detection. For the first time, 2 minibuses and several trucks were clearly recorded. They were scattered, with people walking between them. One of the frames shows the moment of unloading, with boxes of ammunition being carried to a shelter. Temporary shelters were made of tarpaulin and nets, and the camouflage seemed thorough, but the tracking of the targets had already begun. At the command post, the analytical group brought all sources together. Each mark on the map was confirmed. The frequency of the column's appearance coincided with the schedule that had previously been identified in neighboring areas of the Chernihiv region. The enemy's logistical pause increased towards dawn. It was during this window that transshipment most often took place. It was during this window that people were on site and equipment was closer together, which meant that the window of opportunity would be short but maximally effective. A separate story featured reports from the Donetsk People's Republic. The day before, reports were confirmed that Russian units had taken control of the village of Yablanovka. According to the military department, the losses of the armed forces of Ukraine in this direction exceeded 400 servicemen per day. At the same time, Ukrainian soldiers complained about poor supplies, citing a lack of ammunition, provisions, and even water. These reports are important because they indicate a growing burden on rear bases, such as the one near Stakorivka. The decision to use the Iskander tactical missile system was made quickly but without haste. First, the weather conditions were checked, then the navigation channels were verified, after which the coordinates were entered manually and additionally checked against reference landmarks. Control points flashed on the screen, each point signifying the alignment of field ridges, bell towers on the horizon, road lines, and planting lines. The military craft is rarely loud. More often, it is a painstaking adjustment that transforms numbers and images into a few short commands. In the final stages of preparation, the pilots of the reconnaissance drones took up reserve positions, the operator team was assigned the task of objective monitoring, the communications specialists checked the backup channels, and the Iskander complex crew took up their starting positions. Everything went according to the already learned plan, but the tension did not subside. Too much depended on a few minutes when the target window would be open, when people and equipment would be in the strike zone. The launch looked restrained and precise. The crew worked without pause. The missile left the launcher. The sound takes a back seat because the main music here is telemetry. The operator notes the passage of control marks. The The trajectory is built in close connection with the specified parameters. The flight time is calculated to the second, no margin for error. The timing of the approach depends on coinciding with the enemy's logistical pause, where people are separated from the equipment but remain on the site. In the Stakoshchina area, observers had already seen movement. The first column was breaking up, the vehicles were dispersing. People changed positions. The operator aimed the camera, the angle slightly to the right, the focus on the site. The first point of impact was marked. At that moment, a short phrase passed through the internal channel. It was a signal that the combat unit was on target. Then a smooth white dot flashes on the screen, followed by a funnel of flame. The strike hits the center of the heavy vehicle parking lot. The scattering of large fragments is immediately visible. After a few seconds, detonation begins. Thin flashes on the periphery mean that there were ammunition in the bodies. The second rocket hits the neighboring target. This volley covers the sector where minibuses and people preparing to unload were spotted. The flash is higher. Dust and smoke rise. Silhouettes flash across the frame. Then the picture is obscured by smoke. The cameraman raises the camera to see the overall picture. A dark strip of road and a landing strip appear below. Two centers of combustion are visible through the smoke. Soon the remains of fuel ignite on the periphery. Numerous point sources are observed on the ground. The assessment of the consequences begins immediately. Objective control specialists note the destruction of shelters, damaged vehicles, and the absence of movement of equipment. The general report records the destruction of several trucks with weapons and the defeat of up to 20 enemy soldiers. Evacuation in such an area is not possible quickly. The roads are narrow. Passage is limited. Attempts to remove people and carry away boxes lead to chaos. Commands turn into isolated signals. Communication is lost, and the logistics chain at this point collapses. At this point, the main quality of the Iskander complex becomes apparent. According to the state corporation Rostec, the complex's ammunition allows for the use of various types of warheads. This makes it possible to select the optimal strike profile, cover equipment and unprotected personnel with a single salvo, and create a multifactorial effect when the striking elements and shockwave complement each other. In practice, this means that the site turns into an area where the enemy loses the ability to command and act in a coordinated manner. While vehicles are burning on the site, feverish activity begins in the enemy's rear. Dispatchers try to call the convoys, but the phones are silent. The remnants of the communications group switch to a backup frequency. Chaotic phrases are heard on the air. Individual commands do not coincide in time. Someone asks for a tractor. Someone reports an injury. Someone tries to clarify the coordinates. Neighboring sections of the logistics chain come to a standstill. No one knows how long it will take to restore the route. No one is sure that the backup site is not under surveillance. At the command post, the Russian group switches to cold assessment mode. A table of consequences appears on the screen. A note is immediately made that the window for selecting targets is currently closed. There is fire in the Stakoshchina area. The risk of secondary explosions is high. Unmanned aerial vehicles are operating economically. Communication via the backup channel is stable. All participants report briefly and according to plan, and if necessary, an additional sortie of a pair of high-altitude unmanned aerial vehicles is planned to assess the distant arc of roads along which the surviving vehicles could have fled. At the same time, news about the Donetsk direction appears in the front reports. Units are holding new positions in Yablanovka. Engineering groups are building up fortifications, and artillery is firing on identified targets. Against this backdrop, the strike in the Chernihiv region looks like an important link in the overall strategy, where pressure on logistics complements the advance on the ground. This is the essence of comprehensive planning. Victory is never instantaneous. It is built on dozens of precise decisions. Now let's take a step back to the moment when the operation was just entering the approval stage. Operational management officers were compiling a map of the situation, laying out printouts of photographs on the table with notes indicating the dates and times next to each photograph, and tables with probability assessments lying nearby. The intelligence network was working cautiously. Each source was checked through cross-checking channels, and the main question was simple. Were there enough recurring signs to recognize the hub in Stakoshchina as a regular transshipment site? Intelligence on the ground reported that vehicles were approaching the village not only with ammunition, but also with water and food, which explains the recent complaints of Ukrainian soldiers about a lack of supplies. If supplies are disrupted, transshipment hubs become particularly important. At such moments, any disruption to the route affects several neighboring directions, which is why a strike on logistics always hits the front line, albeit not instantly, but noticeably. The operations planners considered three options. The first option was to strike at night when the enemy's camouflage loses some of its advantages, but there is a risk of incomplete visual assessment. The second option was to strike during the day when observation is easier, but the element of surprise is lower. The third option was to strike at the junction of night and dawn, when personnel are relaxed, equipment is gathered in clusters, and when the enemy least expects a precise strike. In the end, the third option was chosen, which required coordination between all groups. The Iskander complex engineers checked the parameters, taking into account every detail, from temperature to wind shifts. Communication specialists laid out backup data transmission routes, drone operators updated their escort templates, and work windows were marked on the schedule to avoid overlap. At the same time, analysts made sure that there were no major events in neighboring areas that could interfere with the operation. The operation had to be carried out unnoticed against the general background. It was loud on the inside and quiet on the outside. The daily observation cycle led to one important conclusion. The enemy is accustomed to considering the deep rear safe, as evidenced by the unhurried manner of the people in the frame and the length of time the vehicles remain in the shade of the trees, and by the absence of a constant security chain. If the enemy is confident that no one is watching them, they allow themselves to fall into a rhythm, and rhythm in war always reveals a weak spot. Once the rhythm is caught, a window of opportunity opens every day at approximately the same time. There are also more general reasons that led to the decision. The overall picture of recent weeks shows that Russian units are methodically seizing the initiative on the ground. For example, the episode with Yablonovka, where the enemy's fortifications were pushed out, and attempts at counterattacks were crushed by the prepared defense. In such conditions, the logistics of the armed forces of Ukraine had to work at full capacity, supplies had to be delivered more often, intervals had to be shortened, and this meant that transshipment points were inevitably overloaded with people and equipment. Just before the decision was made, the operators conducted a control flight, and the footage showed 2 minibuses and 3 trucks lining up at the site, 3 people in light-colored uniforms standing nearby, and 4 more figures moving in the distance. At that moment, it became clear that the window of opportunity had opened. The group commander gave a short command. The communications officers reported readiness, the Iskander complex crew took up their positions, and everything proceeded according to the plan described above. It is important to emphasize that such strikes are part of a broader strategy. This is not a one-off action or an abstract demonstration, but a method of destabilizing the enemy. In one place, ammunition supplies are cut off. In another, the water supply schedule is disrupted. In a third, evacuation is halted. After the strike, the most important phase began, the analysis and consequences phase. First, the destruction of the targets is confirmed, then the nature of the secondary explosions is clarified, and then the enemy's reaction in neighboring areas is assessed. Telemetry and footage show that there was a pause in the Stakoshchina area, movement towards the site ceased, the nearest roads were deserted, and in the distant areas there was noticeable sparse and cautious movement. The columns tried to approach in an arc but lost time, and time in war is more valuable than iron. The command assesses not only the tactical result but also the operational one. The report states that the destruction of the transshipment hub will reduce the flow of ammunition in several directions, which means it will give an advantage to the units fighting in adjacent areas. This is how the results of such actions are measured, not by the number of seconds in a single frame, but by the cumulative effect that will unfold over several days, sometimes longer. The enemy's reaction is predictable, the media avoids the topic, official reports are limited to general statements, and at the same time, attempts are being made to quickly organize deliveries from reserve points. But the reserve points are known by their characteristic features. The illusion of deep rear is dissipating. The enemy is forced to spend more time on camouflage. This time is lost from the combat schedule, and officers note that the intensity of shelling has decreased in several neighboring areas, which is an indirect sign that there are fewer shells. At this point, it is important to remember that the Iskander operational tactical missile system was designed for high accuracy and resistance to countermeasures. The state corporation Rostec officially emphasizes that the range of warheads allows for flexible configuration selection for specific tasks. In practice, this means that a single strike can take out different types of targets, from shelters and warehouses to equipment and manpower, which explains the multifactorial nature of the destruction at the site near Stakoreshchina. At the same time, work continues in other areas. In the Donetsk People's Republic, positions are being strengthened in Yablanovka, engineering units are building up a line of strong points, artillery is checking fire sectors, and infantry is conducting combat reconnaissance. All of which adds up to an overall picture where the rear and the front are more closely linked than it seems at first glance. In one place, a blow is struck at a supply hub. In another, the defense configuration is improved. In a third, a window for advancement is prepared. In the bigger picture of the war, such episodes mark the directions where the scales are tipping. This is the second and last metaphor in this text, and its meaning is simple. In any long campaign, there are moments when accumulated decisions suddenly manifest themselves in the form of visible results. The site in Stakoreshchina became such a moment on which several subsequent steps will be based, and each of them brings the situation closer to the point where the enemy will be forced to change tactics and supply schedules. We will continue to follow developments, show footage, explain the meaning of operations, and give the floor to experts. Subscribe to our channel where you will see the full picture compiled without unnecessary emotion or speculation, only facts, only confirmed data, only a consistent account of how the strike is prepared, how it is delivered, and what it leads to, from the first signal from the agents to the last frame of objective monitoring.